and welcome everyone to this literary criticism session. Today's session is an overview of the Literary Criticism 2022 reading list selections. Our presenter, of course, is no one other than the famous Mark Bernier, who is always great to share his time and talent and wisdom and everything with us. So Mark, thanks again for joining us and giving us some insight on this year's reading list.
Thank you, David. Before I forget, and Sylvia, thank you for sending a poem. Yesterday, I made a request that anybody who wishes to have us look at a poem together on Friday, that is tomorrow, the second session of Poetry Explication, send something my way. If I get it in time, I'll get it in proper form and send it to David and Glenda and Lisa, and they'll get up and have it as a source for us tomorrow, in addition to the poems left over, I might call it that, from yesterday's session. Today, we're looking at the reading list. I don't have a handout for that for a couple of reasons that I won't get into, but it goes along the line. I'd rather do something face-to-face, and when I do put together a reading list, as I've done over these past 12 years or so, a commentary toward the reading list and understanding of the reading list, I stand in front of you guys, and that's not what I'm doing today. So I'm just going to talk about, and necessarily driven by the contest and by your responsibility as coaches, talking to your lit critters, how it is that I approach these particular works so that they best understand them in the context of the contest. Certainly not trying to displace, I'm not a usurper, displace the critical literature, the secondary literature that has much to say about what we understand about Barrett Browning and William Shakespeare, certainly, and our new selection from F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. It is that I am promoting myself as writer of the test so that you can understand, hello, Catherine, can understand perhaps how it is I will find questions. So we'll begin with Barrett Browning. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Fell in love with Browning a couple times in my life, once in high school, and then once a few years ago, and that's, I guess, easily reckoned with. If you go to the list of poems that I've used over the past few years, Barrett Browning for a while there popped up 2 or 3, 4 times, and her Aurora Lee transfixed me at one point about 10 years ago. We can't do Aurora Lee. That's one heck of a challenge. But what she does in her poetry was quite considerable, is quite considerable. And at one point there in the 1850s, when our friend Wordsworth passed, and she was considered, at least she was nominated, or her name was put forward as Poet Laureate of England. We all know that Tennyson got the spot. But if I recall anything, I don't think we picked up a poet laureate in the UK that is a woman until this century. So whether or not that was a vast movement to have her as poet laureate, certainly she was nominated, and it is the case that her poetry asks us to spend some time with. As I've had trouble in the past finding anthologies that cover the poets that I choose, and one of the reasons I choose some of the poets is that I can find an anthology. Barrett Browning, that was a tough one. Finding one with all her poetry was either finding an anthology that was very expensive, or one that did not have enough copies available there. So what we have is, as you see on the reading list, not only the sonnets from the Portuguese and a very inexpensive edition, but also I've added some other poems, not all sonnets, to get us a better sense of what she has done. It is not and cannot be a successful attempt to give a broad view of what Browning has done for us, leaving with us what she gave to the world and to Robert. But it is the case that I have found poems that I think I can bring to the contest a number of multiple choice questions, and that is the criterion, multiple choice questions that reflect something of what she does with the terms and the concepts that we spend so much time with in the handbook. So it is that we look at about 8 sonnets from the Portuguese, and we look at 6 other poems, I believe, 2 of which are sonnets and 4 of which are not, that suggests that she goes well beyond. All this having nothing to do particularly with the 14 poems I've chosen, but as I hope all of what we do, myself in picking this and also looking for suggestions from y'all, and you working with the lit critters in your flock there, it is that I hope they go beyond simply the literature selections that end up on the reading list. So Barrett Browning's poetry, whether it addresses the social issues of the day, the political nuances of the middle of the 19th century as Britain's in the middle of its second empire, or, and we pick up a lot of that with Tennyson, of course, but it's there with Browning also. And touching in on the spiritual and the religious, all of those concerns are in her poetry, but they don't show up in the poems that I can find that allow me to ask those questions, that allow me to put them on the test sheet, allow me to promote the way I have to an investigation by way of multiple choice questions. So there will be questions that have everything to do with those aspects of poetic expression that we love so much. At least we spend time with it. The similes and the metonymy and the figures of speech beyond just the imagery. And she was very innovative, and which is one of the reasons that she was, even as a woman, remember this is the same time Marianne Evans. Marianne Evans was having to publish under a man's name. Here we have Barrett Browning. And of course, it had a lot to do with her association with Robert. Here she is, and unapologetic as a woman, writing beautiful poetry that caught the attention of those who, and ourselves, who appreciate such things. So I will ask questions about form, easily enough on most of it, in terms of sonnet, some of them Italian, some of them not. Might ask questions about the literary concepts, as I've already indicated, melopoeia, the assonance, the alliteration, those sorts of things, especially with the early test, the 2 invitationals and the district test. And then the tropes and figures of speech, wherein we find her driven by the purpose, as we say classically, I guess, that her poems, her sonnets are love poems, and to a specific love. There is quite a bit of the personal in there that's rendered in the recognizable, which makes for a good poet. Tennyson tried that, and we have to spend time living Tennyson's life. I don't think we spend time living Barrett Browning's life, except in Aurora Leigh, but in her sonnets, we have that universal love, we have that universal expression of love and need for companionship. And so thematic concerns and tonal aspects of the sonnets that might crop up, even though it might well be that that particular tonal aspect or thematic concern is applicable to all the sonnets in this sequence, including the 8 that I've picked. So that's my approach there with the sonnets. Here I'll remind before I call for questions, as I look at the clock and see that we need to move on a little bit here, not spending a lot of time with Browning, that in the tie-breaking section of the test, part 4, for the invitational A and B that I write, and for the district test that I write, one of Barrett Browning's poems, or excerpted from the poem, a longer poem, will show up as the focus of the tie-breaking prompt. So it is that there's a good chance that at one of the poems, one of the sonnets that's not on the list, but is in the anthology we've titled Sonnets from the Portuguese, she's titled that way, that might show up in the tie-breaking part 4 that the student might write toward an understanding and analysis by virtue of answering my prompt. But having spent time with the other poems in the sonnet sequence, that should be more of an opportunity rather than a full-out challenge. So once again, part two of the test has three genres represented. One of those genres is poetry. And these last 10 years or so, I've gone with 6 questions from the novel regarding the novel, 6 questions regarding the drama, and 8 questions, totaling 20 now, 8 questions associated with the poems. And in part 2, you will probably see 2 of the poems or excerpted poems from the reading list, from which I expect some kind of indication of understanding through the questions I leave on the test. So I throw it open to either chat box questions or unmute yourself, please, and share a question or a reminder that I just misspoke. Hello, Devin. Nothing for me today? Well, okay. I hope I've covered as much as I think David, before we started the recording, suggested I'd answer all the questions. I'm not going to answer all the questions. The questions might well be, what questions are you going to ask? So as a bridge from Barrett Browning to William Shakespeare, in that they are both poetry, right? This is a verse play, Macbeth. The questions that I might bring forward, the items on the contest itself, are questions that, one, as I've already said, a very crass sort of reminder, that have to be formulated as a multiple choice question. And other than that, something toward an understanding of not only the narrative aspect of, for instance, the drama or the lyrical poems of Barrett Browning, what's being rendered toward an understanding, but also the voice being used. In Barrett Browning, she is the speaker, but she is a speaker versed, pun intended, in poetic expression. So too is Shakespeare. So those voices, the voice of Barrett Browning and the voice of Duncan, the voice of Malcolm, the voice of Macbeth himself, and at times even after the transition, but certainly before the transition, the voice of Lady Macbeth, there are poetic expression that is William Shakespeare's thrusting upon his characters in character, expressions that I can call to task with the lit critter. Is this a metaphor? Is this a simile? Is this onomatopoeia? So it is that not only are you trying to understand the characters in the play itself, you're understanding how Shakespeare transformed, let's back off of that one, used the language, and using it so wonderfully transformed our modern English in the manner that he has. A lot of the expressions and a lot of the words themselves coming out of the canon, his personal canon, his 36 or so plays. So when we read Shakespeare's Macbeth, it should be that we're reading not only to understand the characters, because I'll ask questions that have the lit critter having to identify who said this. Not as a trick question, but it is that as we make our way through the drama, we should recognize, as we recognize our classmates, as we recognize at a distance, now that we're kind of coming out of quarantine, the different sorts of people that we might meet in the mall or at a restaurant, and we make these personal evaluations. Shakespeare, as any good dramatist, they're in a well-made play or a well-made novel. The structure is there to develop our understanding of the characters, so the characters represent something in the way of complications, 2 sides, 3 sides, conflict in some manner. So this is not as arbitrary as sometimes our friends seem to be. There is a development of character. A story that most of you or some of you have heard before, I take myself back about 25 years. I had a colleague in the same hallway And she came to me one day. I was teaching these kiddos, or I was doing what I could to teach them. They're a very good group of kids. And we had gone through, and necessarily it was Macbeth. It's what was in the anthology, and it's the shortest of the tragedies. But on their own, in groups, they were to approach a Shakespeare comedy. And so I had a group, and the mother of one of the kiddos in that group came to me. What are you asking them to do? And I said, well, I said, why do you bring up the question? And she says, well, this is what they're doing. And she showed me what they were doing was differentiating among the characters with stick figures. So that they'd recognize, I believe is all that ends well and all that, the different characters in that play, and be able to make these determinations, as I've suggested I do in the contest here with the questions, who said this? And I said, that's a great idea. And she said, look more closely. In fact, the stick figures that the kiddos had assigned to each of the characters, well, they were anatomically correct. I said I wasn't asking them to do that sort of thing. But it is along those, David's not smiling, so maybe I told the story too many times. It is that the student, I expect the lit critter to be able to differentiate among the characters by virtue of what Shakespeare has them say. Not some obscure quotable passage from one unimportant exchange, because a lot of Shakespeare's, not a lot, enough of Shakespeare's lines are there to cover dress change and costume change and things like that. But there are very, very discernibly different approaches to a concern that Shakespeare has: a Lady Macduff approach, or a Lady Macbeth approach, a Duncan approach, a Malcolm approach. And so we should know the characters well enough to know who's saying what to whom. Out of the offerings, one correct answer and 4 distractors that you find in the questions. As I've indicated, if it is that Lady Macbeth gets flowery with her speech, be the serpent underneath the beautiful flower, and if that's a metaphor, or if that's a simile, it is the case that I expect the lit critter to recognize what Shakespeare is doing with the language itself. So a knowledge of the plot lines, certainly. A knowledge of how the characters represent the storyline. And as we have, not so much as we have in King Lear, 2 storylines, but there is certainly a parallel in Macbeth, several of them, in fact. The most obvious is Banquo as foil to Macbeth. So the student, the lit critter, should be able to recognize in a context that has a particular subject matter at the focus, whether Macbeth responds to the witches, to the weird sisters, to the fateful sisters, or it's Banquo responding. If it is that Shakespeare has, pulling from Holinshead, the protagonist Macbeth usurping power from Duncan, that is killing Duncan in order to become king, there's a parallel in Act 5 where, as Malcolm becomes king, there's Macduff having to do the same thing that Macbeth. So there's reinforcement through parallel. The students should be able to recognize that. And if I draw attention to something that is essentially an indication of that parallel, they need to be able to differentiate between a Lady Macbeth, a Lady Macduff, a Macbeth, a Macduff, a Malcolm, or a Duncan for that matter. I will not ask which of the 3 sisters, which of the 3 witches said this, that, or the other thing. But along those lines, we should recognize that the witches do not speak in iambic pentameter, and not all the time do the characters speak in iambic pentameter. And there are reasons the criticism will speak to that. Your students should, however, recognize that there is a shift. When the supernatural, the witches speak, it's not the same meter. Those sorts of reckonings of Macbeth as literature, having characters who interact, having a language that the characters use that prevail not only in carrying the narrative forward, but also in offering in this stylistic notion of Elizabethan drama, the beauty of language, and also the storytelling reinforcement coming along lines of parallel plot and parallel incident. So there will be 6 questions regarding the plot, the language of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Questions for me, please. Beyond the stick figures, and maybe just put the stick figures aside, I've never said this before for reasons that might become obvious. The access to the web allows us to go to, for instance, Macbeth and find famous quotes. And that might be the same with Browning, and it might well be the same with Fitzgerald. And they're famous quotes, not because someone has sat down and gone through each of these pieces of literature, each of these works. They're up there because readers, not unlike how we contribute to Goodreads, have found something of interest, which isn't to say the list is a definitive source of important lines from, for instance, Macbeth. It is a list of, and you'll see them repeated, I'm discovering. It's a list of those lines that people have found interesting for one reason or another. And if they have found it interesting, there's a good chance I have found it interesting. So it might well be that one of your lit critters is in charge of whatever Lady Macbeth has said, or whatever Duncan has said. That kind of participation in a study strategy, using the resources that most of us never had when we were growing through our literature. So that's a suggestion. We're working with F. Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby. The original list had Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson, which is an incredibly fine work with its problems. Problems would give rise to questions and discussion in the classroom, in the UIL session, the extracurricular. Not unlike Shakespeare's plays. King Lear has all kinds of problems. Hamlet has problems. Problems in the sense of points of lacking a linear move through a plot line, number of things. And in no way is Pudd'nhead Wilson polished, but it is a work I'd like to return to, and I'll just say it this way, at a time when things are less volatile, when people understand the world, when we're not overexcited about which light bulbs we're being told to use or not. So I've moved to Gatsby. By way of introduction on Gatsby, I'm going to back up to Browning and to Macbeth. I chose Macbeth and I chose Browning because it's been a difficult year. And I think most of us have enjoyed Browning. And I think most of us have spent time with Macbeth. And so that it's not too much of a challenge as we get back into a face-to-face classroom, all my fingers are crossed, in a full-time sort of way, put behind us the vagaries that are associated with exactly what we're doing now, the Zoom, and start to enjoy. I thought maybe it would be that if we had on the reading list works that are not as challenging, let's say, as Conrad, certainly, or maybe even a King Lear, if I were to go with Shakespeare. So it is that Gatsby's in that same sort of category. As I spoke about this the first day with beginners, I have a long history with Gatsby. One chapter has to do with choosing to take an undergraduate class with William Harmon when he was a guest professor, a visiting professor at A&M some years back. And I sat in his survey of American Lit, and Gatsby opened up to me under his tutelage there. And so it was the first novel I ever taught as a summer reading to a group of kiddos. there's a lot to be said. And anecdotally, J.B. Priestley has, in one of his detective stories, one of his characters walking into a drugstore and seeing the novel there on the shelf, and the character in this bit of detective fiction says, "It's time to read Gatsby again." And for me, this is a good time. Maybe the catalyst is a little different, but here we are with Gatsby. Two of my favorite novels are Conrad's Chance, I recommend it, and Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. Both of them are narrative tour de forces. You read Chance, and if you're not paying any attention to it, you lose track of who's telling the story. And there are 5 narrators in Conrad's Chance, and it is seamless. And not unlike Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where we have Marlowe who has become the narrator of all time, Ford Madox Ford develops a narrative approach wherein we look back to understand the story. In Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Marlowe pretty much tells the story in a straightforward chronological order. Ford Madox Ford does not. He works in more information that's deeper into the past as we move forward in the narrative, so that the story is essentially told inside out. The oldest events told last, the most recent events right there in the narrative present. And it is a manner in which the narrative is asking the audience, the reader, to trust him. Nick Carraway does this. And our friend Fitzgerald spent time with Conrad, spent time with Ford Madox Ford, didn't spend apparently much time with Henry James, with his objective consciousness and all that sort of stuff. But what Fitzgerald and the Gatsby do is put Nick Carraway, the narrator, with us. We're having to trust him. He's having to trust us. He tells the story, his story, as well as Jay Gatsby's story. And he opens up with, my father told me to reserve judgment. And by gosh, he reserves judgment in terms of how he tells the story. And he wouldn't be telling the story if he hadn't made a judgment. Which is to say, I find the narrative aspect of The Great Gatsby very important in my questioning when the chance allows. And that chance, once again, is guided by, can I find 4 good distractors? I will ask a question about how the story is being told. The parallels are there, not unlike as we've just discussed with Macbeth. And so I would find a way to make sure your lit creators can make distinctions between Martha and Jordan and anybody else that seems to, in this overview of the Jazz Age of West Egg and East Egg and the Valley of the Ashes in between, how they stand out as representative of Nick Carraway's coming to terms with his own coming to terms with the world that Gatsby has entered, and becomes an iconic representation of that which is a dissipation. As we know, Carraway comes from the Midwest, which I guess if we all watch Cheers, Woody is that good fellow from the West coming to Boston into the den of iniquity. So too, it seems that Fitzgerald wants us to understand that this good Midwestern Nick Carraway comes back to the East and has to has to find him a place in his own encounter with that which is iniquity, all that which is secretive, how it is that Gatsby got his money, and all that is representative in his parties, and where Carraway introduces himself purposefully or otherwise. He finds himself in the apartment with the Wilsons. He finds himself at the parties. He finds himself at the pool with Gatsby dead. And he must make something of that, which is a coming of this naive narrator coming of age in a world that is not the world he grew up in. So not unlike with the drama, I will quote from the novel, and it is that in the background, we have to recognize that every word in the novel is not the characters that Nick Carraway meets, it's Nick Carraway's remembering. Now, that's a metafictional sort of concern that we have to put to the side, as we do with any first person narration, or to that, if we get specific about it, so too with the omniscient narrator, and accept it as the world that it is. What we are encountering is Nick's memory of what has transpired. Put that aside, we should be able to recognize the difference between and among the iterations, the leaps of glee or whatever it might be that Daisy has when she sees the shirts, and know that it's not Jordan. And moving along those lines, as I've already expressed with Macbeth's characters, we should be able to tell the difference in Fitzgerald's characters, even though they are all of Carraway's making. So too, Fitzgerald, in the beauty of his prose style, there are literary techniques, literary devices, literary terms, literary concepts, all of which are part of the Holman Harmon handbook. So there will be questions about simile, if it occurs, if I find a good one, or a metaphor or hyperbole. Be attuned to that, the critters, coaches, as you move through it. If anything jumps on the page as a question with which you should have, by way of understanding the fullness of the contest, some familiarity, be sure to circle that and see whether or not I can make a question of it if we're using this as a study guide. So those are my approaches to the three genres, the poetry, which is for the most part lyrical by virtue of the closed form, the sonnet, but narrative in that it is a sonnet sequence. The verse play, Shakespeare's verse play, which is narrative in that it tells a story, but it's dramatic in the manner that it tells the story. And then in the prose fiction piece, that is not a verse play, but it is a narrative in the sense, in the very real identifiable sense that it is telling a story. But we have found that, and I think you can go to almost any list, and we have plenty of them on the web, do we not? That Gatsby will rank in the top 5 in the American English language canon. So we have 3 approachable authors, and I think 3 approachable bodies of work. And I look forward to sitting down with them this summer, these pieces, and coming up with some questions to put on the page and have ready for Invitational A, probably whenever y'all see it in December. And I'm willing to take questions by way of email, and hopefully see you at the student activities conferences if they materialize, if the universities that might be holding them agree as protocols are looked at. So questions, please, on what I'm doing with Fitzgerald's Gatsby, what I'm doing with Shakespeare's Macbeth, or what I'm trying to do with the narrowed selection of Barrett Browning's poetry. Please, either chat room or unmute. Is my Am I open? Angie, you're laughing or something. Am I not hearing you guys?
I
Catherine.
don't have any questions. My
Okay.
summer brain is just absorbing.
Oh, okay. That again, something in the way of a compliment. No, I find these sessions terrible for me. I am hang in there, Catherine, and I'll talk to you anyway. Sometimes I wish Diane's microphone would stop working. She's not listening, so I know I can't tell you what I'm going to ask you on the test, and I know that would be a great help. And I don't know what I'm going to ask because I read, for instance, Gatsby 4 times, and I do it with a different color of ink each time, and I watch myself grow through. And I've just retired of late, and somewhere in one of these 95 boxes of books I brought home from my office is my original copy of Gatsby, and I'd love to have that in front of me so I could see how much I've grown in terms of response from my annotations and my marginalia from way back, and I won't tell you how long ago. So I understand the summer brain and all that, but I'm looking for any kind of questions, so I'll skip you, Angie. Hi, Tommy, anything? Jimmy?
Well, I didn't catch, and you may have said it, but I would, the Elizabeth Barrett Browning, as we, you were talking about, as we come back to some sense of normalcy to things, are you pretty heavily influenced by, I don't even know if I can ask this question, but there's a lot of social injustice that Barrett Browning deals with. Does that pique your interest? Is that a way that we can press that into our kids? Or
2 things. Yes, and yes.
That's 3
Focusing
answers.
mostly on the last part there, in that the social injustice to which the social injustices to which I was reading something that popped up on the stage on the screen there for a second. The social injustices she addresses are in some of the poems that do not allow me to ask a lot of questions because there's not the alliteration, there's not the metaphor and that sort of thing. So that's why in part they don't show up. You alluded to the times. I'm being very careful right now. Social justice issues are near and dear to my mitochondria, much less my soul, in addition to my soul. But this is a different world right now. So whereas everything that I have done in the last 13 years, there's something in my choosing of a novel or a poet or a play wherein we can find immediacy in the thematic or the simple plot line, so that you and your lit critters can go way beyond what I'm going to do with the questions on the test. Now, I'm less careful, to answer your question, I'm less careful about those things at a state meet, wherein I have anybody who wants to challenge me on something in the room with me, all the coaches right there. So I am very attuned. That's why I fell in love with her, not in high school, but later on. She's aware of the world around her, and she addresses that without apology. And it shows up in Aurora Lee nicely. But it's not that which will constitute something that, 1, I can find multiple choice questions, and 2, that I am eggshelling right now, walking on eggshells, I think, unnecessarily, but necessarily. Thank you for allowing me to speak that way. David, I missed a couple of chat room questions.
They were about invitational tests. I think we have Rebecca's question answered.
Okay, thank you.
Bonnie has just put a personal note in the.
Okay, I just missed it.
Are the new lit crit coaches aware that there are other materials available to help them?
Oh, fair enough. When we go to the student activities conferences, new lit crit coaches, or when we would be doing this in Austin, especially at Austin, it becomes very apparent. There is a hallway full of tables that address, that have good people doing great things, or sometimes great people doing good things, trying to include you in there, Bonnie, somewhere, with study materials. And that's listed on resources on the drop-down window at the UIL page under academics, under resources, additional information, additional resources. What is it?
Additional resources.
Additional
I'm putting it in
resources.
the chat box now.
Okay, and so these good people, whether it's Linda Tarrant or Bonnie Crisp, and I can go on and on. I miss Ruthie, and I miss Marcia. They and Chuck does great stuff with virtual UIL. There's plenty out there. Thank you, Bonnie, for bringing that up. So go to that link that David's just put in the chat box, and you can find some good material. The material might not be ready because of my late choice, my changing of the novel selection, the prose fiction selection. And so give them a break. And these same vendors, these same good people often provide the invitational meets with tests that have been constructed by good people who know the stuff, who work for them. So there we are. And we also have, if you really get in a bind, and for David always responds to the email, but if you have a specific question about a specific test, send me an email and I'll dig into my files and find something for you. I'll remind you that there is, especially the new coaches, there is on the website associated with literary criticism, a guide, a master list of all the terms. It's going to be all the terms that are associated with the main part of the handbook, the literary terms that I've used over the past 13 or so years. And they're listed. The first column has the particular test, which is, say, State 2018. Then it has the term I'm testing. If that term I'm testing is in boldface, and I'm working on editing that all the way back to 2009. If it's in boldface, that's a term I've used in the negative, not, you'll see there are 3 of those on each test, not one of the 4 master tropes. And then the last 4 columns are the distractors for that particular question. So there's also a reminder that if you send a request to my email, dieburn@sbcglobal.net, I will send you a Word file that you can manipulate a lot easier than you can a PDF. So yes, turn to Bonnie and to Linda and to Marcia and to Ruthie and to Chuck and everybody else, and names of Peggy, everybody else who work hard, sometimes across all 21 contests. Some are very specific, as Bonnie does with literary criticism, and their supplies or additional material, they are a good resource. Any other things? Any other questions?
Looks like you've satisfied everyone's
Oh, I doubt that.
curiosity at this point.
Devin, was it you who asked about the rhyming of school with another? I've put that term for the reverse spelling rhyme on the list that David's going to have up there. That is an updated handout for the poetry explication. That list at the end on page 8 has, I think, 4 new terms: transumption, metalepsis, and a couple other things in there. Heteromerous, oh no, homoteloton, that's right. Angie got that one up there. So a little early today. I can't give away what I haven't written, and I'm not going to give away what I'm thinking I'm going to write, but just an overview of the 3 genres. Darren, okay. So please, and especially as we get into the fall session, when you have your lit critters together, we might be able to do a conference call. Or David says to me that if I get a school to take care of Bonnie, if I get a school to, and of course this is difficult with COVID, get a school to sponsor something of a workshop, and there are any number of schools driving to that school. So I'm not just doing a little workshop for 1 or 2 schools. If I'm doing it for 5 or 6, I'll be glad to drive almost to El Paso, because there's always birding somewhere, and come out that way and do a little workshop, or over the phone, as I suggested in a conference call come fall, when you have your Lit Creek team trying to figure out how to go to either a student activities conference or to homecoming, whatever happens. Hey, El Paso, we were out there about 9 years ago, Rebecca, maybe 50 years ago. We were out there with the Scotsman there on the border at that high school, and that's a long drive. I'd love to meet you halfway, Van Horn, and pull up some people down from Kermit and everywhere else, maybe even Angie from Sonora, but I guess that's in the future, Rebecca. Yeah, I haven't seen Waco tanks, and I haven't been in the Blue Mountains in a long time. So Blue Mountains or Guadalupe Mountains, I can't remember. What are the mountains there at El Paso? That's how long it's been. So thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge.